Breaking news, the Nikon Z6 Mark III has leaked, very deliberately, by Nikon, who is allowing reviewers who are currently testing it to tease it. But what those reviewers can't tell you is all the specs. I can give you all the specs and show you pictures. So here is the Nikon Z6 Mark III before you're supposed to see it. I'm going to compare it to the current Z6, the Canon R6 Mark II, and the Sony a7 IV to see if Nikon is leapfrogging the competition. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Squarespace. Anytime you need a web presence, something on the web, start at squarespace.com/Tony. That gets you a completely free trial. Look through their gorgeous templates, adjust them to match your style, your colors, your fonts. Once you love it, the coupon code Tony will get you 10% off, and you can do things like get your own custom domain. Like I have northrupphotography.com. That's so much more professional than just using social media. Thanks for sponsoring us, Squarespace. Before we talk about the Z6 Mark III, I want to cover breaking news of camera thefts in Central Park, New York City. Chelsea and I just spent an entire month in New York City, and my own personal experience was that I was not comfortable bringing out my traditional camera unless I absolutely had to. So most of the time what I did was I just used my smartphone. And you know what? It's a pretty good camera. I would rather have a traditional camera, not just for image quality, but for the experience, for the tactile buttons, for the flippy screen that lets me get more creative angles. But in any metropolitan area, theft is a problem, not just the United States. Manny was just robbed in Italy. Everybody in New York City also has a $1,500 iPhone. These are super easy to grab from somebody's hand and pocket and run, but you can't then do anything with it because they're all protected by a PIN code, at least. But smartphone manufacturers won't even give us the option of that. Even the bare bones anti-theft that we suggest, which is a little splash screen at startup that says this camera is owned by, and lists your name and phone number, and is not currently for sale. That would be a huge deterrent for people trying to resell stolen gear. They will not give us anything or even have a conversation about it. I bring this up every time there is a new camera theft because I want you to reach out to the manufacturer and tell them that this is the feature you want, preferably in free firmware updates. We're a little tired of just seeing higher frames per second. Give us practical features that improve our security, our safety, and make photography fun again, because walking around New York City constantly looking over your shoulder for somebody who might rob your camera and quickly sell it for an easy profit, that's not fun. Okay. But this is fun. The Nikon Z6 Mark III specs and photos brought to you by NikonRumors.com. This is Nikon's mid-level full-frame camera suitable for portraits, events, sports, just about anything. And the third generation here is going to be better than ever. Nikon is doing something I've never seen done before, which is they are telling the people currently reviewing it that they can tease it, that they can show blurred pictures of the product. So like Chris and Jordan at PICS are showing themselves using the product before it's even announced next week. We unfortunately, we don't have it in our hands. We were not picked by Nikon to select it. And in fact, Nikon has not sent us any gear for review since 2018, when they launched the first Nikon Z6. And in our opinion, it wasn't ready. We were critical of things like the autofocus because we wanted you, the consumer, to make educated decisions. And unfortunately, being frank in a review, being critical of flaws in a product, sometimes leads to you being cut off by the manufacturer. Now for the specs. The Nikon Z6 Mark III should have a 24 megapixel sensor, just like the previous two generations. And I don't expect it to be a stacked sensor like that in the Canon R3 that I'm filming with. Stacked sensors have a very fast readout that allows them to have high frames per second and almost eliminates rolling shutter. This probably won't be that because I think it's going to be a lower price point camera. Though the sensor is 24 megapixels, it will have the pixel shift feature that can take multiple pictures and stack them together. Unfortunately, I've never found this to be practical in the real world in our Sony cameras, our Canon cameras, or in the Nikon ZF that has a similar feature. So we don't use it. We don't actually think you should factor it into your buying decisions, though sometimes it's useful in studio environments. Now, they're really hyping the video for this. Even in their teaser, they're showing it being used for video. And it sounds like it's with pretty good reason. It sounds like this is going to provide us 4K at 60 frames per second, full width, and in ProRes RAW. Now, what I don't know is if it will also do a compressed 4K 60 or if they have to output it in RAW because of limitations of the processing capabilities of the camera. Myself, while I occasionally use RAW for things like wildlife video where I really need all the dynamic range, generally I'd rather have compressed video because the file sizes get so huge and that slows down my entire workflow. So subscribe and we'll get you that update as soon as we can. I do think it's going to be full width, which is a big advantage over the Nikon Z6 Mark II. It's a big advantage over the Sony a7 IV. The recording times, they say, are going to be 37 minutes to 120 minutes. So I'm hoping that the 37 minutes applies to 4K 60 RAW. That would be a pretty good recording time without any kind of overheating. You know, cameras like the Panasonic S5 that just launched can do 4K 60, but it can overheat pretty fast and even in like 15 minutes at a time, which isn't enough for a lot of scenarios, including this news piece that I'm recording right now. It will do high-speed video at 1080, which is full HD. And they're warning it's with a crop and with 8-bit. So I'm going to guess that this is going to be with a pretty serious crop or with pretty serious line skipping. So it's not going to be the highest quality of video. It'll be a little bit blurrier. But still, the ability to do 240 frames per second, which is 8 times slow motion, that's useful to some cinematographers who want to like mix in some dramatic footage. I love being able to shoot slow motion, so that's one of the things I look for in a video camera. It's going to have a full-sized HDMI port, which if you're using an external monitor, is really pretty important because the smaller HDMI ports, they just wiggle loose and that screws up your entire shoot, right? I've had that happen, and that's why I now insist on having a full-sized HDMI port, and I'm glad to see Nikon adding it because they're taking video really seriously with this camera. Nikon is teasing that the screen is going to be brighter, that you'll be able to see it in sunlight, and that is so important. I don't know the specifications of this, but I'm hoping it's like a bright OLED screen, something like what you get in your iPhone. I hold my iPhone side by side with any camera screen. The iPhone is so much clearer and brighter in sunlight. I've been begging manufacturers to give us screens that we can see on these expensive cameras, and it sounds like the Nikon Z6 Mark III is going to be the first to really do that other than Hasselblad. So thank you, Nikon. Now, the frames per second, that seems to be what a lot of manufacturers are focusing on now. It is going to do 14 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, which means basically no rolling shutter, limited rolling shutter, and 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter, which will have some additional rolling shutter, I think, but probably still be acceptable. It sounds like it's doing 4K at 60 frames per second full readout, and if it can do that, then it means the rolling shutter can't be more than 1/60th of a second, at least for the 16:9 portion of the frame. So that to me means that the electronic shutter should be useful for a lot of sports and wildlife scenarios, allowing you to shoot silently at a high frame rate that makes it a more versatile camera, and I can't wait to try it out. It will shoot JPEG files at 120 frames per second, which actually exactly matches the JPEG capability of the Z8 and Z9. Now, they drop down to 11 megapixels, but it's still full width. Now, the reason they have to drop down to 11 megapixels is the sensor can't read out that fast. The processor can't handle that much data, so they're basically skipping every other horizontal line and then dropping every other vertical pixel. So the resolution goes down by a factor of 4, from 45 megapixels to 11 megapixels. But you get an increase in speed by 4 times, right? And in sports photography, I found it to be extremely useful on the Z8 and Z9. It produced really great results in high-speed situations. So I'm excited that this is coming to a lower level camera than those more expensive Z8 and Z9s. But I also want to warn you, there's going to be a downgrade in this. It's going to be lower resolution. Now, if they use the same algorithm that they did in the Z8 and Z9, then these are probably going to be 6 megapixel images because you might have to divide by 4 in order to get that fast readout. The alternative might be a really heavy crop, so it suddenly becomes much more telephoto. Nonetheless, I like that Nikon is giving us more and more options for things rather than sort of artificially holding features back. Nikon being in sort of a distant third or maybe even fourth place in the camera wars, they're a little more willing to just throw everything in with the hopes that they can convert some. Because they don't have a large portion of the camera market today, they're not worried about cannibalization. And that means they can provide a better value to camera buyers. The maximum shutter speed is 1/16,000th of a second. I suspect this is probably with the electronic shutter. It wouldn't be impossible with the mechanical shutter, but I think it would be the fastest mechanical shutter I've ever seen, and they probably wouldn't put that in their entry-level camera, so I'm betting that's with the electronic shutter. Like the predecessor, it is going to have one CF Express Type B card and one SD card. So you can write to two cards simultaneously, but if you try to shoot RAW to both, it's going to become bottlenecked by the performance of the SD card. In these situations, I write RAW to the CF Express Type B card and JPEG to the SD card just as a backup. This will make it superior to the Nikon ZF, which has an SD card and one micro SD card, which was a crazy choice to me to put it on micro SD card. I so would wish that we could have just gotten some internal memory, but again, the camera manufacturers seem primarily focused on just increasing frames per second rather than giving us more workflow and lifestyle features. As for the form factor, the body seems to be sort of a cross between the existing Z6 Mark II and the Nikon Z8. It's going to be a little bigger than the Nikon Z6 Mark II, so not everybody is going to like it getting bigger, but it is adding more capabilities, and if it feels better in the hand, I'm all for that. It's going to launch on June 17th at 8 a.m. Eastern. They haven't told us the price, but I think it's going to be about $2,000. Now let's take a few minutes and compare the Nikon Z6 Mark III to the predecessor, the R6 Mark II and the Sony a7 IV. The Z6 Mark II is currently selling for $1,600, which makes it a pretty good value. They're both going to be 24 megapixel cameras. Now the Z6 Mark II also did 14 frames per second, but real world testing, shooting moving subjects, which is when you need the fast frames per second, I did not find I actually got 14 frames per second in the real world. Whereas I know the autofocus is going to be much improved in the Z6 Mark III, so it should be able to go much closer to that 20 frames per second, but subscribe and we will actually critically review it and tell you exactly what to expect from it in sports situations. The Z6 Mark II doesn't have that 120 frames per second high-speed JPEG mode. The Z6 Mark II has a tilty screen, which means it's not that useful for people who might need to occasionally film themselves or put the camera into a corner or shoot an overhead shot. The flippy screen of the Z6 Mark III is going to be a big win. And while the Z6 Mark II can do 4K at 60 frames per second, it only does it with a 1.5 times crop. Which means you often might need to change your lens if you were switching between 4K and 4K 60, or if you were shooting stills and then video, because otherwise you would need to zoom way back and then your depth of field would change. I hate when I use video modes that have a heavy crop. Why did you get a full frame camera if my video is going to be APS-C sized? So the Z6 Mark III, I expect it to be able to do 4K at 60 frames per second, full width, no crop. So for those of us who shoot 4K 60, like our whole channel is 4K 60, that is a huge win. Compared to the Canon R6 Mark II, I think a very close competitor. We love the R6 Mark II. It works great. The autofocus is fantastic. It's great for sports, portraits, just about anything. I think they'll both be the same price, the same number of megapixels. The R6 Mark II actually higher frames per second. It will do 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter, and it's pretty useful because the readout speed of the R6 Mark II is pretty good. The Z6 II will only do 20 frames per second, so that's actually half. But if you're willing to drop to some sort of degraded format, the Z6 Mark III will do 120 frames per second bursts, which the R6 Mark II cannot do. They both have flippy screens, but I'm betting the Z6's screen is going to be better in the sunlight because it'll just be brighter, and they both have 4K 60 full width. So when I draw this up, these two cameras seem almost identical. But Canon is pricing a lot of their bodies really aggressively, and so is Nikon, which just means it's a great time for consumers to get cameras with these capabilities at $2,000. It's great that we have more options, right? Now, Sony is not competing very well in this segment. They don't have a camera that can do 20 frames per second at this price point. Really the closest thing they have to this segment is the a7 IV, which is priced at $2,500. That's 25% more than the Canon or Nikon equivalents. And it does offer 33 megapixels, higher megapixels, but a lower frames per second, just being limited to 10 frames per second because of its pretty slow readout speed. That's a big disadvantage. It has a flippy screen, but again, you can't really see it in the sun, and I have higher hopes for the Nikon. And while the Sony will do 4K at 60, again, it's with that 1.5 times crop, which is enough that I'd just never use it, and I would either drop to HD, 60 frames per second, or shoot everything in 4K 30. So compared to Sony, the Nikon here is the clear winner in this segment if you plan to shoot some sports and you need that higher frames per second, or even if you're just video-centric. If the Nikon's autofocus can keep up with the Sony, which remains to be seen, then I think it's a big winner. In the comments, tell me what you think. Are you going to order a Nikon Z6 Mark III? Is it tempting you to switch teams? Let me know. And thank you to our sponsor, Squarespace, who has been sponsoring us for 10 years. We've been using Squarespace websites for 10 years, and I have been happy for every minute of it. I've never seen them go down. They've regularly offered me new templates, new designs that I can switch to keep the look of my website fresh. They work perfectly when every new iPhone comes out, because you've got geeks working for you to stay on top of all this technical stuff so you don't have to. And that's why squarespace.com/Tony is the right place to start anytime you want any kind of presence on the web. Get a beautiful, powerful design with a store, take appointments from clients, track detailed analytics without having to develop a bunch of nerdy skills. You can focus on doing what you do and let them take care of the hosting. When you love it, after your free trial, the coupon code Tony will save you 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. Bye.